Today's session is entitled Storytelling with TED Data. And the reason I've called it that is because when we look at all these different data metrics that we get in OD and HR, they will tell us different parts of a story, but it's often up to us to piece those things together and really understand what's informing that. And that will then inform the support or the work that we do or the next steps that we might advise to a team. So when we think about TED data, today's session is going to focus a little bit on how to gather the TED data. Now, I'm sure lots of you will probably do this quite a lot. Some of you might not do this so much. If you're a new organization onto TED, you might be waiting till you get enough data in your system. But I'll show you some examples of how we've done this at Lancs Teaching. But as always, happy for you to share your ideas, or if you're doing anything differently that would be good to share with others, please do sort of pop that in the chat and I'll bring you in at appropriate points. But what I'm going to focus on is different ways of interpreting your TED data that will help you tell the stories that help you perhaps influence in the right way to different stakeholders. So something that I'll focus on is there's sort of different levels of data that different people might interest different people. So we'll have a bit of a look at the website, see some of the new sort of layouts that are in the updates to the system, and just show you some of the ways we use data at Lancs Teaching. So first slide here tells us that data doesn't tell us what to do. It helps us ask better questions. And I think that's really a good way of looking, or really a good way of perceiving your data, because on its own, most data doesn't tell you the full picture, and that even counts for TED. And I'm always very open when I talk to teams about TED that doing one TED survey isn't going to solve all of their problems, but what it can do, it can help them to ask the right questions about the right things and explore the topics which are most important to them. So at a team level, this is definitely the case. But also when we look higher up in the organization, when we perhaps look at large data sets, we look for trends in things, we might identify patterns in data, but actually it's still not telling us the fuller picture. We need to consider what is informing those trends. What types of things can we learn from those trends? How do we build on them perhaps, or how do we change trends? So there's often questions which will arise from looking at data, but it's not to say that data isn't useful to us. What it does do is it underpins the work that we do. So often, chatting before we started the recording, we were talking about qualitative data. Qualitative data might tell you a story, but it's hard to really make changes based on qualitative feedback unless you have something tangible to build on. So I think when you combine qualitative and quantitative data sets, it can be really powerful and really strong and help to inform confidence in the decision-making process. When we think about storytelling, there are different points that we need to consider. So first and foremost, I think it's always important to consider the context in which that data was collected. So thinking about who is it about, when was it collected, what else is happening. And I think that's important at this time of year. I'm sure you're all perhaps in the process of sharing your staff survey results with your teams across the organisations, and part of that narrative will be around how that data was collected. So it's an external collection of data, it's anonymous, it's a national standard, it's done in the late stage of the year, so it's October and November when it's collected. So all of that will help to inform you on where that data is coming from. But it's important to recognise that that data is specific to that context in when it was collected. And that can change over time, particularly when we're talking about people-related data. And the same goes for TED. And that if a team completes a TED today and they complete a TED this time next month, then the results might differ because there'll be different things on their mind, maybe different priorities, maybe something's changed in the last month. So we always need to remember that it is a shifting workspace when we're thinking about data. Next thing to consider is any signals. So what I'm getting at here is things that stand out. It might be outliers from your data, it might be trends, it might be things that are informing that data. So keep your eyes out for things which really sort of stand out from the data, I guess. And sometimes this can be easier than others. Next point is around the meaning. So that sort of builds on that. What stands out? Where are the patterns? Where are the differences perhaps? And I think when I talk to teams about doing follow-up TEDs, these are the sort of things they might be looking out for. So looking, where are there upward trends that we can celebrate as a team? Has anything gone down since last time? What's the difference in our spread of results compared to last time? And I've got an example from one of our teams a little bit later in this slide deck that I can show you to see how teams have done that. And the final point, and perhaps the most important point, is actually, what does it mean? What can we do with it? And I think this is something we really tried to emphasize with TED, in actually giving practical steps that teams can take with that data, because data is only really as good as how you use it. And I think from a team perspective, it's important that when a team does their TED survey, they use that to then ask the right questions, to learn more about a situation, but then be able to do the correct things, or maybe use the right toolkits that are appropriate to them and their situation and how they currently work. So that's always been a big emphasis for us through TED. Next one. Has anybody heard of Steve Head? I'm sure there'll be a few people. I'm getting a few nods from people in the audience. I think he's very well known in NHS spaces. He's I guess he's like a motivational speaker. He does a lot of things for NHS teams. I think he did a lot throughout the COVID pandemic as well, supporting NHS trusts. I know at Lancs Teaching, I've been at a few events where different departments have invited him in to support away days or annual reviews maybe. And this is a slide I pinched from Steve. But the idea is, when you look at this data, what sorts of things stand out to you? Does anyone want to come in? I'm sure some of you will know the answers to this.
We use it all the time, Lee.
Yeah.
And we finished on the slide of be a 149er rather than being a 15.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Be the positive, see what's right, not what's wrong.
That's absolutely right. And I think what Steve's getting at here when he shows this is that I think it's human nature sometimes, and I'm not sure if it's an NHS thing as well, but we're sort of hardwired to look for where's the problem in this. So when you look at this, it's clear that the 1, the 4 and the 9, they're correct answers, but the 15 is wrong. So 4 times 4 isn't 15. So it's very, very easy to focus on the outlier and think, oh, that's not right, and think, oh, we need to fix that, we need to get that right. And I think that can be useful in some cases, and absolutely we shouldn't ignore things that might be a problem. But what Steve is getting at when he talks about this is actually 3 out of the 4 questions are correct. So it means we're getting the majority of things correct. You could look at this and think, well, we're 75% right, so we're doing a lot of right things. And I think what Steve's getting at is it's just as important to focus on the successes as it is to focus on the problems or the challenges that we might have. And as I say, I think my experience with a lot of NHS teams is that this can be hard to do, because I think often they're working really high pressured environments where from one day to the next there's a new challenge, a new fire to put out, if you will. So they're sort of hardwired to be looking for those problems, investigating them, problem solving. But often teams struggle to create the time to reflect on all the successes that they've had, all the positive outcomes that they've had, and all the sort of learning and development that they've done, the progress that they've made, that a lot of teams don't take that time to focus on the 149, as Linda says. So yeah, if you haven't heard of Steve Head, I'd recommend go to his website. I think he's got some good YouTube videos as well. But I guess the sort of narrative there is, remember to focus on the positives as well as any negatives. And I think this can apply quite well when we look at TED reports. So when you look at a TED report, sometimes I see, particularly new teams, I think they might struggle with, actually, what story do I want to tell with this? What is it actually telling me? And I think the reality with any data like this, not just a TED report, is that you can paint very different pictures depending on what sort of lens you look at the results through. So when we look at this, so this is my pharmacy technicians one that I use as part of all my training. So it's a TED report here. There's a few reds in there. There's quite a lot of greens. There's some ambers, some widespread, some narrow spread. So it's quite a balanced TED report, really, compared to a lot of ones that I see. But what we could do with that, we could interpret it really positively and put this really positive spin on it. So we might look at it and think, actually, 20 out of 29 questions are green, so that's really strong. The majority of questions are green in there. We've got a really strong team purpose because all of the questions in that area are green. Our questions on leadership are green, so that's a real strength for us. And we've got high team engagement. So if we wanted to, we could paint that super positive picture and paint that perspective that, yeah, everything's great, we are a great team, and really sort of big it up. Now, I think there can be benefits to that, but there's definitely challenges to doing that, and I wouldn't encourage any teams to do just that. But I think what I do see a lot of teams do is do the opposite and focus on the negatives that are in there. So another way you could look at exactly the same data is to say that we've got 4 red areas that aren't working. We don't focus on quality and continuous improvement because that's a low scoring question. We don't have enough resources because that score is really low. And we don't work well with other teams because we've got a low score in that area as well. So in the same way that we could be super positive, we could also be super negative about our results as well. And as much as it is important to understand the negatives, I think what I would encourage teams to do is try and find a balance which is appropriate for their current context and their current situation. And it might be that this is a team who's maybe on a bit of a journey and they are building up again after a significant change. So if that was the case, you might want to lean closer to the positive sides and use the negative elements as next steps in what we're doing. If this is a team who's maybe been high performing for a long while and they're using this as a way to build, then maybe you do lean more on the negative elements because these are your opportunities to improve. But it's important to still have some element of balance by painting that positive picture and reminding the team that we are a strong team, we get a lot of things right, and that's our platform to build on as we go forward. And I guess what I'd encourage teams to do is, rather than focusing on a positive story or a negative story, focus on the learning story. So what can we learn from this data? How can we reflect and improve from where we are on now? And how does this inform our way forward? So what else do we need to take into account with this? Because also a team might want to think of, what does that future context look like? Maybe across 2026, a team might be looking and thinking, we've got a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of change going on in the organisation, or with change affecting our team. So actually, our goals might be to think around, how can we maintain these levels? And it might not be about necessarily improving anything. It might be about saying, how do we keep our core strengths consistent throughout a period of uncertainty or change in our team. So I think that illustrates just how there can be different stories you tell depending on that context or situation for any one team. Okay, so next area I wanted to cover was a bit of the why data is important. So thinking about those different stakeholders that I mentioned before, when you talk to people about TED, you might get different types of questions from different people. So you might have senior leaders who are interested in actually, how does TED make a difference on the bigger picture? So if you're doing work at a team level, how does that translate into things like staff survey results, or ultimately organizational performance and positive patient outcomes is the sort of big sort of end game from all of this, I guess. Really, when you think of perhaps more middle managers, they might be asking, how does engagement data help me make decisions? How does this inform which teams we need to be aware of, where we target support, where we get OD in to help? It's those sorts of things that more middle managers might be interested, who maybe sit across multiple teams and might have access to multiple teams data within that, or you might be reporting on the amounts of teams that have been doing TED for them. And then finally, at a team level, you might get team leaders asking you, actually, okay, this data is all well and good, but how does it help us in our day-to-day things? How does this help us make changes that make a difference? And how does it inform us what are the right things to do? So there's different stories can be told there with different, I guess, levels of data or different ways of presenting or interpreting the data. So we've got these different levels, and I guess for us in OD and HR, we sit across all of these different levels, because at different times in our work, we will be informing these different stakeholders on perhaps priorities that they might have or practical steps that they can take. And with this, we might be combining TED data with those other types of metrics that we mentioned earlier. So things like sickness absence or retention data, freedom to speak up requests, all those other sorts of people measures that we have across our organizations. So if we think about this from a storytelling point of view, team leaders are interested in how TED data might help them understand their team's engagement. How does it inform what they do? And the stories they might be interested in is, what stories can we see from other teams as to how this has helped them? What are those practical applications that have really helped teams build on where they currently are, or maybe navigate challenges that are similar to the ones we have? When we think of perhaps middle managers, department or divisional leaders, they might be looking at how they can give recognition to those teams that are perhaps leading the way with this sort of thing. Where might other areas need support? What are themes that we should be aware of? So the stories you might be looking to tell those types of stakeholders might be around the trends that you're seeing. So what was the changes year on year? What are the comparisons across different parts of their department maybe? So looking to really paint that broader picture. And then when we think of that strategic level, perhaps our senior leaders, these are often perhaps the decision makers around TED. It might be them who's signing off on a TED contract. So with those types of stakeholders, they'll be looking around, how are we getting a return on investment from the resource that we've invested in TED? How is TED making a difference on things like our staff survey results? Or how is it perhaps impacting on your time from an OD perspective? So how is it hopefully saving you time or expanding your reach as an OD function in terms of supporting your teams? So there's different types of stories there that we can tell. So I'm going to go on to the website in a moment, but this is a slide from last time I did this session, and I just want to sort of highlight the different sort of stages that you'll get to, and all of your organizations were perhaps at a different stage in terms of the amount of data that you've got available to you. So things you might want to think about are, first of all, the short-term data. Especially if you're a new organisation to TED, you perhaps want to build up that database of historical data, multiple teams, maybe teams going through it multiple times, but you can still start to learn stories from those individual teams who are doing TED. And I think the easiest way to do that is to talk to those teams, ask them about their stories, ask them about what went well, what maybe didn't go so well. Maybe think about your own stories as an OD function. How has TED changed the way that you work? And how do the TED reports that you're seeing from teams, how do they fit into that story that you might be telling? These types of stories might be things that will influence new teams to do TED, but they might also be things that will influence others in your organisation to take note of the opportunities available with TED data. When we think about the medium term, I'm thinking here perhaps 6 to 18 months on board with TED. You'll get to a stage where maybe you've got teams who have gone through TED more than once. You'll likely have multiple teams across different areas that have started to use TED. So you'll be building up that database of organizational data. So you can then start to use the reporting features in TED to pull out that data and start to learn from those themes and trends. And then perhaps after you've had it a year, you might be using that alongside your staff survey results to say, how have the areas that have engaged with TED a lot, how have their staff survey results been influenced by that TED activity that's happening? And then I guess in the longer term, so we're talking maybe 18 months plus, those of you that have maybe been on 2, 3, 4 years now, for many of you, you might be able to now look at long-term comparisons. So what's the difference with teams who are doing TED now compared to teams that were doing TED a couple of years ago? How have things perhaps changed? You know, is there any difference in maybe the way we deliver team leader training now compared to how we did at the start? Is there any difference in the sort of ways teams are using it when they perhaps used it 3 or 4 times over a number of years? Are you seeing innovations that might tell you good stories to influence other teams, or are you seeing things that at that bigger data level that will help influence your work and your support from an OD function? And also things that might help us from a central TED perspective. So it might influence new toolkits or new support resources that we can provide to teams. Okay, so at that point, I wanted to very quickly just take you through how you can use the data. So I know many of you will be familiar with this. Can I just check? Can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah, fab. Okay, so I'm on the TED website now. Those of you, I'm assuming most of you will be trust admins, but when you come on to TED, you can get to your organisation level data through the left-hand side under the reporting section. Now, it does look a little bit different recently because we've sort of updated some of the graphics, but you can get all the same data you used to be able to. Your headline data will be displayed in here. Now, something we have fixed in the most recent update, this didn't used to filter out surveys with less than 3 responses, and that's the way it was always intended to work with TED. So what you'll notice now is, particularly in the last 12 months, which I think can be useful, you can look at that and see actually how many real TEDs have taken place. So that should hopefully filter out any training surveys you've done where no one's responded to it because it's just been a demo, or even if teams have set up their own test ones before they've sent out a real survey. So that can help in there. Further down, you get other metrics, so you can look at things like month-on-month comparison with the previous year. You can look at growth statistics. I'm not going to go into all of these too much because, yeah, those of you that use it will use it a lot. Those that you don't use it might not need it. But at the bottom, which I think can be useful, if you're looking at comparing different areas of your organisation, and this might be useful now you've got your staff survey results, you might want to compare different divisions maybe. So let's have a look at, if I wanted to compare corporate services to estates and facilities, I can see there's differences there and maybe things that we can learn from those different staff groups. Maybe I want to add diagnostics into there, and we can see that's very similar to what corporate services are experiencing. And as we scroll down at the bottom, we also get an indicator of our top performing and our lowest performing questions. So again, if I'm looking at telling stories with this data, what I might look at this and think, actually, there's a story there around team purpose. So in our organisation, people find their work meaningful. And Ted is telling us that this data is helping to inform that narrative. So this might be something where I maybe want to go and talk to some of these teams, explore it a little bit more, maybe tell some of those stories that will help to inspire others and really raise awareness of that meaningful work that teams do. If we're looking at some of the lower scoring questions, we might look at this, and the one around resources is the lowest scoring question. So we might want to think around how can we support teams to use their resources in the best way? What sorts of stories are teams telling us about their resources that underpin this, and what are the resources that are most important to those teams? So as I said earlier, it helps to inform those sorts of questions. Scroll right back up to the top. So there are 3 data exports in TED, as there always has been. So you get the opportunity to export trust data, surveys data, or users. Now, to be perfectly honest, I think the most useful one is the surveys data that you get in here. And what I'm going to do, if I can just slide along, I've put them all into different tabs of the same spreadsheet, but when you click on them, they will download a separate spreadsheets. The trust level data that you get, this will show you sort of an overview of all the data that you've got. So it shows you numbers for your different divisions, how many TEDs have been set up, how many have participated in those TEDs. It gives you overviews for the divisions. Now, I think this can be useful if you want to get that high level measure. Maybe if you download this report periodically, you can look at changes over time. But I think the drawback of this data is that it's not filtered by date. So you don't know. I mean, for us at Lancs Teaching, this has got years and years of data. So as a snapshot, it doesn't really tell us much around what that picture is now. So what I'd want to do is dig a little deeper into this. If I go on to the survey export, you'll get a form which an export which looks something similar to this screen. Now, I've taken out the team names and owners to protect anonymity of teams, but in here, the way I use this is to really tell stories about the amount of team engagement that's going on in the organisation. So when I do this, I provide monthly reports to our organisation. And one of the first things I'll do when I do this is I'll go along to participation numbers and I'll filter out those non-TED surveys. So I'll uncheck 0, 1, and 2, because anything with less than 3 responses won't have generated a report. So I can be confident now that I've got all the surveys which are real surveys in there. What I then might be looking at is maybe I want to get numbers for our corporate services division, let's say. And I want to see, okay, in the 12 months where we report on, so that's from April, how many surveys has this division done? So I might be looking at that, seeing how many have been created, and I can see 10 teams have done it over that period. And I might want to compare that to the previous 12 months, and I can start to pull out those different types of data. Now, what I'd say is this export can be really useful for other things. So you can also look at things like teams who've done TED more than once over a period of time. You can look at, if I pull all these back in, and if I scroll down, I've highlighted a couple where a team's done TED more than once. So let's just, if I filter out my NCS, it should help us find that. So what I've done here, before I deleted the names, I picked out a team who'd done TED twice over a couple of years, and this can help me tell a story around what's what difference has this team seen over a couple of years of doing TED? So if I look through this, I can see that on their first survey, they were getting the scores in the region of 3.4 in the threes, and they've gone up to 4 point something on their high level TED scores. If I want to dig a little bit further, I can start to look at individual scores on different themes, or even if I come along, just bear with me, Excel's going a little bit slow for me at the moment. I can even look at individual questions in there if I want to dig even further for this particular team. And for teams that have done it even more times, I get even more of that data trend. So there's different things I can start to tell with that story. Just to give you a bit more insight into what we do at Lancs Teaching, and I will share this template with you following today's session along with the slides, or just for reference, that's the user export one. Each month, what I'll do, I'll pull out our annual or to date this sort of financial year, how many TEDs have gone. So I'll produce a report, something similar to this, and I will pull it into a division comparison. So again, you can use this template if you want, you can create your own, but what this will do is it helps you start to understand different stories that might be useful for those perhaps divisional leaders or maybe senior leaders in your organization. So looking at the data I pulled out here, so I mentioned before corporate services might be 10. I'd fill in the numbers from each of those things I've filtered out in there. And the graphs that I put in here show us year on year what has been the trend with different areas. So when we think about stories we can tell with this, I might look at this and think, well, there's a story to be seen in medicine there where we've seen a gradual improvement year on year, and actually this year is their best year ever. We might tell a different story when we look at surgery, who had a real big peak in that year but has sort of slowly fallen off in the year subsequent. So that might prompt me to ask questions to the senior leaders on, you know, what might be influencing this. Is there extra support we can give? Why is engagement in TED going down in that particular area? And then there might be other areas which are scoring lower. It might ask us to think around, what are our comms like around TED for those particular areas? What are we perhaps doing differently, or what could we do differently to engage with different parts of our trust? Similarly, down here, we've got a couple of graphs which shows our growth month on month. So this graph here, I just put down our numbers from 1 month to the next, and I can see here which areas might be contributing most to TED. This is in our pie chart as well. So we can see surgery is the biggest slice of the pie there. So they contribute the biggest amount of TEDs to our organisation. And we can also see, are there peaks or troughs in different times of the year? So there's different ways of presenting that data, I guess is what I'm getting at. And we can also show that at a trust level. So we can show that, okay, we've had a gradual rise, maybe a dip in the last year, and we're sort of catching up with that this year on that sort of trend. So it helps to inform what that direction of travel might be like and what new things might we want to try with it. Okay, just come back to my slides. Yeah, just reading the questions in the chat. So yeah, Chloe, absolutely. I'll share that spreadsheet, and then if you want to just put your numbers in, you can absolutely do that. Okay, so I talked about a team story before, and I wanted to share these next few slides are ones that one of our team leaders has put together from our speech and language therapy team at Lancs Teaching. And it's a really good example of how their TED data has sort of underpinned the story of their journey that they've been on. And I think always with these things, I'm reluctant to say that TED has changed the way that team works, but it's been part of that broader work that the team and the team leader have been able to do. So it's helped to inform their work. And I think just as importantly, it's helped to reassure them that they're doing the right things. So what this team found is from their staff survey data way back a couple of years ago now, things like their engagement scores were something they wanted to improve on. Team culture questions in staff survey were reporting things like strained work relationships, people not necessarily feeling valued by the team or attached to the team. And there were there were disagreements in the team. Morale was quite low, and it was something that they knew they had to address, otherwise it would keep going down year on year. So what they did is they kicked off by using TED to inform that conversation, and really it sort of mirrored what staff survey was already telling them, really. So I think TED didn't necessarily offer them too much new. It just helped to reinforce those themes that they were seeing from staff survey. But some of the things they did pick up on through TED were through the free text comments in here. So we can see comments like the team need to communicate better, they need more or improve respect, they need to work on civility. So these sorts of things were telling that little bit more of the picture as to why these engagement scores were quite low. We can see the TED report there on the left, so we can see it's by no means a really terrible TED report, but that you can see there's lots of differences of opinion in this team. There's lots of ambers because there's diverse views on both sides of in terms of whether you're really engaged or really disengaged for different questions. And that quote from the team leader in the circle there said that at that time the team didn't really feel like they were a real team. They felt like they weren't working together, and they knew there was work to be done. So TED helped to inform that and sort of, I guess, paint the picture of that starting point in that story. So what they did, they used that to hold more team communications. They got us in from OD to run some sessions on civility. We directed them to some of the TED Toolkit activities as well that they could use on that. They had a focus on training, and for their leaders and supervisors in the team, they committed to doing 360 feedback, so they were getting more data to understand about their own role in that improvement journey. They focused on being open and honest in the communication. So they tried to create more psychological safety around what they did. They worked on culture and came up with their own culture contracts through one of the TED Toolkit resources. So they used that to inform their work over 2024. It was that they were working on this. And in terms of where they are now, what the team leader has told us is that they now feel that they're flourishing on a human level, that they have those stronger relationships. And most importantly, they feel like a team. They feel like they're there for each other. They feel like they felt okay to be able to challenge behaviours which weren't accepted by the team, having a clarity around the zero tolerance approach, I guess, and that culture of open and honest communication. And coming back to what I said right at the start of today's session around what is that learning story, what questions can we ask, and how can we keep getting better based on where we are and where we're heading. And the data backed them up in what we saw. So they did a second TED in 2025, and so clear improvements in what they were doing. So in their follow-up TED, you can sort of see in the report there, lots of ambers that turned into greens. I think importantly, more narrow results. So there was more consensus around the team. And a lot of the feedback in there was really positive around the work that the team leader had done, but that the team had done together, and how they felt more aligned with the team. They felt more connected to the team. So great credit there to that team leader who took on board that feedback from TED and used it as a catalyst to drive important change. And then I guess the other part of that story was to back that up. What did it show in staff survey? So in our most recent staff survey results, they showed improvements across the board. So their engagement scores had gone up, team culture, leadership scores had gone up, morale had improved. And again, I think we can't put all this down to TED. It's definitely not just TED, but TED helps to inform that, and staff surveys help to inform that. And importantly, that ability to revisit those same data points through consistent TED questions, consistent staff survey questions, has allowed this team to be able to check in and reassure themselves that they are heading in the right direction and they're doing the right things, because they've got that tangible evidence which underpins that story that they're telling about themselves. So really, really positive example there. And that was that team that I'd highlighted in our TED data. And those are the things that you might want to consider trying to pick out of your TED data. Where are the teams that have done TED multiple times? What is that telling us around where might there be a story that we can tell that might inspire others, that might help others or encourage others to get on board with TED? So I'll share these slides with you, then you can see this as an example. We have a recording. I'll need to get the team leaders permission to be able to share it a bit more widely, but hopefully it should be okay for us to share her sort of narrative of that story, which I'm sure is a lot better than mine. But what things we can also share with you, and we might have already shared with some of you, we've got lots of different case studies. Some of you on the call today will have contributed to some of our case studies that we have from around our NHS clients of how TED has been used in different settings, how the data is showing tangible improvements that justify the work that teams have been doing and that organisations and OD departments have been doing. So just to sort of wrap us up, I guess the things I want you to consider going away from today is, what stories can we encourage those different stakeholders to tell? So from a team leader perspective, you might be wanting them to use the stories from their TED data to inspire their team, to celebrate their strengths, to recognise opportunities. Division department leaders, you might be encouraging them through the TED data you provide them to encourage team ownership of it. You might want them to be advocates of the process. You might want them to be engaged with the themes that their data is showing them. And from an organisational perspective, you might want them, those senior leaders, to understand the engagement work that's going on across the organisation and how it is making a difference for teams across multiple areas. And also, where is that translation into other data metrics like sickness absence, like staff survey results, those things that are really important at an organisational level. And I think we can also flip this to think around, what stories do these stakeholders want to hear from us as well? So I've mentioned these a few times as we've gone throughout today's session. From team's perspective, they might be looking for examples of how TED can help improve morale in their team, or how it can help them take positive steps. So ones like that speech and language therapy team would be good ones to be able to share. From a departmental leader perspective, they might be looking around, what's the relationship between TED activity and sickness absence? I think one of our case studies, I think it was from Somerset, shows that in a team environment. So, but you might want to look at this at a bigger level across departments if you've got I guess enough TED data in an area to link to that. You might also, from an organisational perspective, be looking to tell that engagement picture. So using TED as a way of getting that year-round engagement measure that leads into that staff survey as your sort of big touch point throughout the year, and thinking around what is that relationship. So you might want to look at areas that have done lots of TEDs. How has their staff survey changed over the years? Or how does that compare against areas of your organisation that maybe haven't done many TEDs over the last 12 months? And what does that tell you? Okay, so just conscious of time, but the key takeaways, I guess, from today's session are to think about the audience when you're telling stories with the data that you get. What stories are they interested in? Secondly, I'd say get to know your data. Have a look at your exports. Have a look at what stands out for you. What are those touch points in there? And if you're unsure, reach out to us. We can have a look at your data for you. We can help you think about things you might want to look for and help to perhaps inform those next steps for further data gathering, or maybe those qualitative stories to get a hold of. And then finally, think around what are the short-term stories that we can tell and how can we monitor them over time to see what those long-term growth patterns are. And that might be in your organizational TED data, or it might be for individual teams. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this question to think of, but please do sort of share with us if you come into a future coffee catch-up event, maybe you want to share some of your data stories, but have a think around what stories you would like to tell. And if you're unsure about how your data might help you tell that, bring it along and we can have a chat about it as a community. So have a think around what could be really useful for you or for other stakeholders across your organization. And then, as always, we'd love to get your feedback on today's session. I recognise today's been very much me sort of throwing information at you, so hopefully the recording will be really useful and the slides, so I will share that with you. But if you can give us feedback, it will help to inform future events. And thanks, Lindsay, you just put a link in the chat for us. And last of all, just to signpost you to our upcoming events. So next month, we're up to our first deep dive of the year. I think we'll be discussing some of the questions that have come through around the contracting process. So I know, I'm not sure if Kim's on the call today from North Cumbria, so that's one they're particularly keen on, so we'll go into that. I'll also be sharing a little bit about our enhanced TED Team Leader programme that we've been trialling at Lancs Teaching Hospitals as well. If you are free for our coffee catch-ups, it's always great to see you all. So our next one is next week on the 18th of Feb, and we've got one in March as well. And our next Lunch and Learn is in April. So we'd love to see you there. So thank you very much. Just about on time, so happy with that. But lovely to see you all as always, and we'll catch up again soon. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.